Hi, welcome to our special webinar presentation today on Christianity's Truth, Goodness, and Beauty, Pascal's Apologetic and the Imago Dei. Thankful that you could join us here. I certainly would love to be able to have this seminar in person, but thankful for the opportunity for us to still be able to have time to hear from Dr. Threlfall, and hopefully it'll be a help to you as you think about your ministry and perhaps have an opportunity to benefit from this even if you're not in our area. And so glad to have you join us here today. We do have with us here this afternoon Dr. Jonathan Threlfall. Dr. Threlfall is the senior pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Concord, New Hampshire, where he and his wife Krista and their 4 children live. He also holds a THM in Biblical Spirituality and a PhD in Apologetics and Worldview from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Dr. Threlfall has published 2 articles related to the topic that he's addressing today, one in Philosophia Christi, the other in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. And so we're excited to have him come. He's going to do his first presentation. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and have a second presentation. And then at the end, we have an opportunity for you to submit some questions and have some Q&A interaction. If you actually do want to submit a question, do so as soon as you have the question. You can email it to info@dbts.edu. Again, that's info@dbts.edu. We will be compiling those questions, and then we'll be presenting those to Dr. Threlfall at the end of the 2 lectures this afternoon. Dr. Threlfall, please come.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's great to be here. I want to thank the seminary so much for this opportunity to present this topic. I think it's very important, and I think it has great practical significance for life and ministry. And so again, the topic, we're talking about Blaise Pascal and his approach to apologetics and how that combines with a theme in biblical theology, and that is the image of God, the theme of the Imago Dei. So very grateful to be here, looking forward to our time together. Let me just tell you what you can expect. So there are 4 main parts to the two talks that I'm going to have, the 1 o'clock and then a 2 o'clock, and I'm going to go through 4 main parts. Here's what I want you to take away with you is, first of all, I want you to be able to grasp a powerful and versatile approach to Christian persuasion, which you probably haven't encountered before. And that is Pascal's anthropological approach to Christian persuasion. I'll explain what that means in just a moment. And the second main takeaway is that you'll have seen how this approach is substantiated biblically from a biblical theological theme, the biblical theological theme of the Imago Dei. And then third, so that you, in combination, as we see how Pascal's apologetic, which I'm going to explain to you in a moment, and this biblical theological theme of the Imago Dei, how they combine to form a very powerful apologetic, even more powerful, I think, than many of the approaches to apologetics that we're often familiar with today. And then finally, I'm going to give you some practical ways that you can apply this in life and ministry. It's going to have a tremendous application for in your own sanctification, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, if you're in Christian leadership, if you're a pastor of a ministry, if you speak to people on a regular basis from the Bible, if you seek to appeal to people to believe in Jesus Christ or to believe more deeply in Jesus Christ. These concepts have application. These are the 4 parts that you'll have grasped: a powerful and versatile approach to Christian persuasion, understand how that approach is substantiated from a biblical theological theme, see how it provides a more robust approach to Christian persuasion, and then see some practical applications of this. I think that this is a very neglected theme. Few people understand really what Blaise Pascal was doing in his apologetic, primarily because we often hear, when we hear apologetics and Blaise Pascal, if you know much about apologetics and you've heard about Blaise Pascal, typically what you think of is his wager argument. And that's where he says, all things considered, you're better off believing in God, believing in Jesus, than if you didn't, because the stakes are so high. You might as well just just say, hey, if the worst thing that could happen to me is I'll have been wrong in this life. But if I don't believe in God, then the worst thing that will happen to me is I'll go to hell. So all things considered, just believe in God. That's the wager argument. And really that played a very small role in Pascal's overall effort to commend the Christian faith. So when you think of Blaise Pascal, he was the 17th century apologist, mathematician, scientist. With respect to apologetics, don't just think of the wager. And I'm going to tell you in just a moment really what his main contribution was to apologetics. Now, before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about my story, about how I got into this topic. So I was working on my PhD, and I was getting to the dissertation stage, and I was talking with my brother-in-law, and my brother-in-law had gone through this process. He had written a dissertation, and he said, Jonathan, when you get to the dissertation phase of your PhD work, you don't want to write on a topic that's going to make you feel nauseated whenever you think about it. You want to write on a topic that you are actually excited about. I think he gave the example. He said, you don't want to go and do an analysis of the minutes of the Kentucky Baptist churches from a certain period of time in the 1800s and analyze that. That might get boring after a while. You want to do something that's really meaningful. And so I prayed a lot about this. And I asked the Lord to give me wisdom to help me understand what I should write on. And I knew that what I needed to write on, because my concentration was apologetics and worldviews, it had to have something to do with apologetics. And so that was a given. It had to be an apologetic in nature. But I also wanted to write on something that was able to connect apologetics with biblical theology. And by biblical theology, I mean the theologies, the teachings about God and other topics that emerge throughout the flow of the Scripture. And I had grown to love biblical theology in my studies, and I knew that whatever I wanted to write on, I wanted to write on biblical theology as well. And another thing that I wanted for my dissertation is I wanted it to be Christ-centered, because Jesus Christ is the most important person in my life. And how to bring all these things together in an academically acceptable and academically excellent dissertation was the problem that I was faced with. I read a paragraph in the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology that helped me with this question. I'm going to read this to you. This is from Peter Adams' article called Preaching and Biblical Theology. And listen to what he says about the connection between biblical theology and apologetics. He says this: "It is not possible to," quote, "take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ," end quote, "without teaching a biblical worldview, and we cannot do this without biblical theology. We cannot help people to address the pervasive worldviews of humanism, postmodernity, secularism, materialism, and pantheism by providing them with a few helpful texts or pious ideas. They must begin to," quote, "think God's thoughts after him. And they do this by learning the shape of God's self-revelation in history and in the Bible. This biblical theology is the best corrective for false worldviews, just as it is the best corrective for destructive heresy. By teaching and using biblical theology in all or Bible teaching, we point people to the objective and historical reality of God's progressive and purposeful revelation. Throughout this revelation, God speaks a transcendent message to people in every age and shapes their minds, hearts, and lives so that they can know and serve him and speak his truth to others." That paragraph grabbed me because I realized that biblical theology, rightly taught, rightly preached, and rightly understood, could be the most powerful apologetic. Why? Because it helps us to think God's thoughts after him. It helps us to interpret the world that we live in, helps us to understand who we ourselves are. Now, my question then was, because I'm telling you the story of how I got to my dissertation topic, my question then was, how am I going to bring biblical theology and apologetics to bear? Well, I started reading Blaise Pascal's writings, the Pensées, and that's simply French for thoughts. Pensées were a collection of writings, fragments that Pascal had written down over the course of his life, which he intended to be a complete work of apologetics defending the Christian faith. He never ended up finishing it. There are a lot of reasons why he didn't do so. Some people say that he didn't finish it because he realized that there was a contradiction in his worldview. Some people thought that he didn't finish it because He realized that his Augustinian view of grace conflicted with some other things that he believed. All those are just speculations. The most obvious reason to me why he didn't finish was that he died when he was young. He was 39 years old. He was not able to complete it because he died as a younger man. And yet these writings that we now call the Pensées, these fragmentary, it's not like one satisfactory, complete book, yet they contain some very powerful arguments for the Christian faith. And as I read these writings by Blaise Pascal, I suddenly felt myself almost being searched for my own pride and hypocrisy. Pascal had a way of just digging right down into my own heart and helping me understand that I was this paradoxical duality of greatness and wretchedness. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So I decided that I wanted to write on Blaise Pascal as the apologetic side of my dissertation. And then I realized that I wanted to bring the work of Blaise Pascal together with the doctrine of the Imago Dei, a biblical theological theme, and to see how those would interface. And so, just by way, that's the story of how I got to my dissertation. And the central idea is that the doctrine of the Imago Dei, that is a biblical theological theme, reinforces what Pascal is saying that is true about human beings as it serves this apologetic, his apologetic project. So, we're going to get into that. First of all, what did Pascal think about apologetics, about the arguments for the Christian faith? Well, Pascal was skeptical about the usefulness of some of the most common arguments for Christianity. For example, he said this: the metaphysical proofs for the existence of God, and these are proofs like the proof from an unmoved mover. Everything we see around us is moving somehow. And so how did everything started moving? Well, there had to be a first mover that wasn't himself moved. That mover must be God. Pascal says, I don't think that those are going to be really helpful in convincing people to believe in God. He says this: the metaphysical proofs for the existence of God are so remote from human reasoning and so involved that they make little impact. And even if they did help some people, it would only be for the moment during which they watched the demonstration, because an hour later they would be afraid that they had made a mistake. He said these are useful only insofar as someone's able to follow the line of reasoning. And yet when they forget exactly how those thoughts were connected, then they're going to think, oh no, was it real? And then he said this. He said, the most important proofs for Christianity are the proofs that speak directly to the heart. And he writes this, and you may have heard this quote before: for the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. Okay, the question is then, how does a person speak directly to the human heart? Here is Pascal's answer: by speaking to the heart's deepest cry, its deepest longing, its deepest craving, and that is to explain to a human being why he or she finds himself in such a paradoxical mix of greatness and wretchedness. And so this brings us then to Pascal's overall case for Christianity. Pascal would have broken down, had he finished his apologetic project, would have broken it down into these three parts. First of all, he would have shown that Christianity is not unreasonable. It's not illogical. There's nothing irrational or subpar about believing in the truth claims of Christianity. The second part would have been to put his readers into such a frame of mind that they wanted Christianity to be true. So he would first of all say this: Christianity is not repugnant to reason. You're not committing some sort of intellectual mistake by believing in Christianity. And second, he's going to make you wish it were true. And then third, he's going to demonstrate that it really is true, okay? So those three, you see the three movements in his apologetic project: say that it's not unreasonable, make them wish that it were true, and then prove that it is so. Now, it's that second part that Pascal really focused on, making people wish that Christianity was true. How in the world would you make anybody wish that Christianity was true? Well, here's Pascal's technique. The way to make people wish that Christianity is true is to show them something about themselves that they cannot explain through any other worldview. And this is the genius of Pascal's argument. And this is why we call it an anthropological argument, because it begins with the human being, anthropos, man. It begins with who we are. And this is an incredibly accessible and close argument. Like, we know what we feel, we know what we think, we know what we experience. This is why it's so powerful. He starts with the experiences that we know, with the feelings that we have, and he says, here's how you can make someone wish Christianity were true. Show them something about themselves that they already know to be true, but yet they cannot explain, and make them beg for an explanation. Prove to them that no other perspective in life, prove to them that no other religion or worldview can satisfactorily explain these paradoxes that they feel to be true within themselves, and then show that Christianity provides that explanation, and then indeed it is true. So that's what you see, that's what he's doing. He said, show that it's not unreasonable, make them wish it were true, and then prove that it is true. In the Pensée, Pascal himself says, I quote this, "Men despise religion," and by religion he's referring to the Christian religion. "They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Show them that it is worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature." So, how in the world is he going to make people wish that Christianity were true? How is he going to show people that they have within themselves some contradictions that only Christianity can solve? Well, I will walk you through how he did this in 3 parts. Okay, how is Pascal going to demonstrate to people that they have something in themselves that can be explained only by the Christian faith? Well, he points out these tensions within ourselves that we feel and that we know. And let me explain them in these ways. There's a psychological tension, an epistemological tension, and an existential tension. All right. So there's a psychological tension, and we can simplify and say this: I feel both happy and miserable. All right. The epistemological tension is that I feel both certain and uncertain, and the existential tension is I feel both significant and insignificant. Okay, and I'll walk through those one at a time. So first of all, there's a psychological tension. And that is that we have a longing for happiness, but misery is perhaps one of the most well-known and obvious features of human existence. So he explains it this way, and I'll quote. He says this: "All men seek happiness. There are no exceptions," indicating that we have some awareness of happiness. So the very fact that you are unhappy shows that you have some idea about what happiness is. And Pascal speaks of inanimate objects. He says a tree isn't as miserable as a human being. Yet a tree doesn't have as many luxuries as a human being. Why? A tree doesn't have the craving that a human being does. We have this craving for happiness, demonstrating that we must have some idea of what it means to be happy. And how does he then go on to demonstrate this from the way he observes people? Well, Pascal lived, as I said earlier, in 17th century Paris. And in Paris at the time, the circles that Pascal ran in had this obsession with entertainment. Does that sound like American culture? Yes, very much so. Lots of parallels between Pascal's 17th century Paris and our 21st century America. And the word that he used in the English translations of the Pensée is divertissement. It's this word meaning diversion, a distraction, recreation, entertainment. And what he's doing here, he's using this theme of divertissement, this theme of diversion, entertainment, distraction, to prove that human beings are horribly miserable. He does it in a variety of ways. He says that this craving for distraction or entertainment tells us that there is a secret instinct driving us to seek for happiness. And he observed this at play in many areas. For instance, competitive sports, hunting, card games, sexual adventures, war, seeking government office, gambling, the theater. And Pascal is saying the problem is not so much that these pursuits are necessarily in and of themselves wrong. It is that in pursuing these things, human beings realize that they're after something they could never attain. Why? Take a hunting trip, for example. As soon as they catch the rabbit, they're off to the next hunting trip. What they're really chasing is not the rabbit, but it's something that they can never actually grasp. They're chasing for happiness, and they can never find it. He talks about tennis. He says these grown men are chasing a ball around this tennis court, and yet they're never satisfied when they play well, because then they want to play even better. He talks about gambling. He says if you promise to give somebody the amount of money that they would earn in one day of gambling, if they instead wouldn't gamble, say, I'll just give you the money in advance. Just promise you won't gamble. He said, they're not going to do that. Why? Because the fun is in the thrill. The fun is in the pursuit. It's not in the thing that's pursued. He says this, that is why gaming and feminine society, war and high office are so popular. It's not that they really bring happiness, nor that anyone imagines that true bliss comes from possessing the money to be won at gaming, or the hare that is hunted. No one would take it as a gift. What people want is not the easy, peaceful life that allows us to think of our unhappy condition, nor the dangers of war, nor the burdens of office, but the agitation that takes our mind off of it and diverts us. That is why we prefer the hunt to the capture. Now, this is a scathing expose of the human psyche. Why are we so obsessed with recreation? Why are we so obsessed with entertainment? If it tells us anything, it tells us this. We can't find happiness in ourselves because we're always seeking it in something else. If there was happiness to be found in ourselves, we wouldn't be looking for it in this recreation. So he is explaining that there is a psychological tension between happiness and misery. He contrasts that with this concept of ennui. It's a French word meaning boredom or listlessness. He says one of the worst things you could do to somebody is put them in a room all by themselves with nothing to do, because then they'll have nothing else to think about but their own misery. So what's just to help you see the context here, what I'm saying is this. Pascal is making people wish Christianity were true. And he's doing it by drawing out these tensions that are inherent in the human condition, one of which is this psychological tension between happiness and unhappiness, between greatness and wretchedness, okay? There's another area in which he points out this tension, and that is in this area of epistemology, what we can know, okay? So not only is there the tension between happiness and unhappiness, the psychological tension that he points out here to prove that we need this explanation for our condition, but also in this area of certainty and uncertainty. He says this, man has within him the capacity for knowing truth, but he possesses no truth which is either abiding or satisfactory. He says we have this idea that there must be truth to be known, but for some reason, we can't seem to be able to find that truth. He writes this, what a figment of the imagination human beings are. What a novelty, what monsters, chaotic, contradictory, prodigious, judging everything, mindless worm of the earth, storehouse of truth, cesspool of uncertainty and error. Okay, so we've looked at the psychological and the epistemic, and now I'm trying to move here quickly because I want to get onto what he provides as the explanation. Now the existential tension. So again, what he's doing is he's demonstrating that he's trying to get people to want Christianity is true, and he does so by pointing out these tensions that we feel to be true within ourselves. This existential tension is this tension between significance and insignificance. And here's where Pascal points out the fact that we find ourselves to be very, very small in the cosmos and also very, very large. He zooms out and sees us in relation to the universe as a whole and says how tiny, how insignificant we are. Listen to these words. Pascal writes this, when I consider the brief span of my life absorbed into the eternity which comes before and after the small space I occupy, and which I see swallowed up in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I know nothing and which know nothing of me, I take fright and am amazed to see myself here rather than there. There is no reason for me to be here rather than there, now rather than then. Who put me here? By whose command and act were this time and place allotted to me? We find ourselves feeling incredibly insignificant, and yet, even though we feel ourselves to be so insignificant, he says it's the very thought of our insignificance that proves our greatness. I think the very fact that I can think about the universe, even though I can feel the universe swallowing me up in its greatness, yet by my mind, I could somehow wrap my mind around the fact that it is actually happening. So you see there's this tension between, why, let's go back to the first tension. Why do we feel this tension between happiness and unhappiness? Going back to the second one, the epistemic tension. Why do we feel this tension between certainty and uncertainty? The existential tension. Why do we feel this tension between significance and insignificance? These create in us a craving for explanation. Why am I so weird? That's essentially what the Pensées is seeking to answer. Why do human beings exhibit such a paradoxical duality? And that is, Pascal says, because we were created by God and for God, but we have fallen into sin. So in the course of Pascal's apologetic, he is trying to get his readers, again, to identify within themselves such tensions that can be explained no other way except through Christian anthropology. The explanation for this paradoxical duality is this: we were created by God, but have fallen into sin. We'll go through those, the psychological, epistemic, and existential, to see how Christian anthropology, according to Pascal, solves this. If true happiness were to be found in finite things, true happiness were to be found in the hunt, in the political office, in the sexual liaison, if true happiness were to be found in these things, then humans would surely have discovered it a long time ago. However, they have not discovered it. Therefore, happiness cannot be found in finite things, and therefore God, the only being of infinite worth, is the only source of true happiness. He writes this: our soul happiness is in him, and our soul evil is in separation from him. So what he's done is this: he's made his readers, his audience, crave to know an explanation as to why we feel this tension between unhappiness and happiness, and saying, well, here's the answer. It's because you were created for God, but you've fallen into sin. You're seeking happiness in things that aren't God. That's why you feel this tension. That's why you feel so incredibly happy. That's why, ironically and paradoxically, you feel even more unhappy in your pursuit of the things that you think will bring happiness. I mean, what other explanation can you offer except that you're not meant to be satisfied by finite things, but only infinite things? You see how this argument is so close to the human heart? You see how this argument is so accessible? We feel that all the time. We experience that all the time. This argument hasn't aged over the hundreds of years since Pascal first articulated. Actually, it wasn't original with him. We find this argument going back as far as Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 11. He has put eternity in the heart of man. Augustine said the same thing in the opening of his Confessions. He says, the heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. So what Pascal is doing is just carrying along this rich tradition, going all the way back to the Bible, that the human heart is only satisfied with something infinite, and that's what explains our mad, irrational running after things to try to fill this void that only God can fill. So he's brought his hearers to this point where they demand an explanation, and the only explanation that suffices is that we're created by God and for God, because true happiness is found only in God. Now, what about the epistemic tension that we talked about? Remember, the epistemic tension is that tension that we have some idea of certainty, of truth, and yet we never can seem to find it. Well, he says Pascal's explanation for that also is found in Christian anthropology. It is because we once had a grasp of truth, because we were really willing to recognize who God was, but now because we've fallen into sin, we as sinners cannot accept the fact that God is a righteous God, and therefore we come with all kinds of narratives about reality that conflict with the reality that we experience, and therein lies the explanation for the fact that we have some sense that there is certainty to be had, truth to be known, but we can't seem to get to it. So the explanation for the tension between certainty and uncertainty, that epistemic tension, is again found in Christian anthropology. All right, what about that third tension, the existential tension? That was the one where we feel this tension between we're really insignificant given in light the massiveness of the cosmos, and yet we have some significance because with our mind and rationality we can grasp it. Pascal says again, where's the explanation? You're not going to find it in any other worldview, only the Christian faith, Christian anthropology. He says humans, they need to realize that they're something, but they're not everything. Human beings want to believe that they're everything or that they're nothing. You see the polarities between an overweening ego and absolute despair. They're both stem from pride. What Pascal is saying, well, human beings, we understand we're something, God has made us something, but we're not everything like we like to think we are. He writes this. No, that's actually a direct quote. We are something and we are not everything. Man must not be allowed to believe that he is either equal to animals or to angels, nor to be unaware of either, but he must know both. He writes, man's dignity consisted in his innocence in making use of creatures and being their master. And yet, in a fallen world, we have lost our proper orientation with respect to God, and that explains that tension between our feeling of significance and insignificance. Our sin, Pascal would say, has twisted that, what God intends to be our sense of proper orientation under his lordship, and we've tried to become our own masters, and that's what explains this paradox of significance and insignificance, that tension existentially. So, Pascal has brought his readers, his audience, to the point where they would wish that some explanation would provide the key to these tensions that they feel within themselves. And now Pascal's third move is to prove that the Christian faith that explains these tensions is in fact true. Now, I'm not going to deal with that part of Pascal's apologetic at all. Remember I said the three parts, going back a little bit, the three parts of the phases of his apologetic approach was to, first of all, show that Christianity is not unreasonable, to make people wish it were true, and then to prove it was true. But in the Pensée, Pascal spends less time actually proving that it is true. He spends a lot of time proving to his readers that they are this tension, this duality between greatness and wretchedness. Okay, so now you have a grasp, I hope that you have a grasp of what Pascal was trying to do, how he was trying to win his readers over to the Christian faith. Now, how do we categorize this approach to apologetics? Well, I've referred to it as an anthropological argument. But if you've studied logic and reasoning, you might ask this, well, in what sense is it an argument? Because you may know that there are different kinds of arguments. There's a deductive argument, there's or deductive reasoning, there's inductive reasoning, but there's also something called abductive reasoning. And Pascal's anthropological approach to Christian persuasion falls into the category of abductive reasoning. Let me explain to you why I say that and what that means. Abductive reasoning is a kind of reasoning that reasons to the best explanation given a set of data. So it would be like this. Let's say I come home from work one day and I see that the window is in the front of my house is broken. My boys are nowhere to be seen. There is a baseball bat lying in the yard. I walk inside the house, and there is a baseball lying amid broken glass. And I'm looking at this scenario, and I'm trying to figure out what happened. Now, I could come up with a variety of explanations. I could say possibly my wife had a baseball bat, and from the outside of the window, she smashed the window with the baseball bat, and my boys came from downstairs, put the ball amid the glass, and they all went upstairs and hid. Okay, that actually accounts for the data. And yet it is not the explanation that best satisfies the data. Why? Because my wife has never broken a window with a baseball before, at least not that I know of. But my boys, however, are more likely to have put a baseball through the window. Just hypothetically, of course. Now, given the data, abductive reasoning comes up with the best explanation for that data. What Pascal is doing, he's taken the data of human greatness and wretchedness. He's taken the data of the epistemic tension of the fact that we have this craving for certainty and truth, but that we seem not to be able to arrive at it. He's taking the data of the fact that people seem to be, through their entertainment, their craving for entertainment, seem to be pursuing happiness but never able to achieve it. Through their sense of significance and insignificance in the cosmos, they feel themselves to be great and yet incredibly insignificant. Okay, look at all that data. Now, abductive reasoning says, I think this explanation best meets the data point by point. Now, this is the kind of reasoning that we use most often. I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. I love to read Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would say that Holmes is reasoning deductively. He says it's just deductive logic. Actually, most often, the kind of logic, the kind of reasoning that Holmes uses in those stories is not deductive, but abductive reasoning. He's taking the data, he's looking at it, and he's thinking, what's the best explanation given this data? One thing that's powerful about abductive reasoning is that it allows you to then predict something that might match that explanation. So, for example, in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, this is from the Red-Headed League. Sherlock Holmes suspects that his client's employee has been digging a tunnel to rob the London bank. And so Holmes and Watson, Holmes wants to see this employee, wants to see what he looks like, and when they knock on the door of the office there, and the employee comes to the door. And Holmes, instead of asking him about what he's been doing, merely asks him for directions. He says, hey, can you tell me how to get to such and such a place? And the employee says, yes, you take here, make this turn. And Holmes says, thank you very much. Then after they walk down the street, Watson asks Holmes, I said, I take it you just wanted to get a look at him. And Holmes says, you're right. And Watson says, did you want to get a look at his face? Holmes says, no, I was trying to look at his pants. And what Holmes was looking for was to see if his trousers, the employee's trousers, were muddy, because if he had been digging a tunnel under the bank, he would have the evidence on the knees of his trousers. At the end of this dialogue, Watson says, well, Holmes, what did you see? And Holmes says this, and this is important for abductive reasoning, what I expected to see. See, in light of this explanation, an explanation of abductive reasoning, if true, will allow us then to look for other clues that will corroborate that or disconfirm that explanation. Now, this is what brings us then to the doctrine of the image of God. Because if Pascal is right about anthropology, if he's right that human beings are this paradoxical duality of greatness and wretchedness, exhibited in their craving for happiness and inability to find it, if he's right about this, then we should be able to find this substantiated in the Bible, right? If Pascal's Christian anthropology is really Christian anthropology, then we should be able to go to the Bible and find out whether or not it is true. Because as I was reading Pascal, I'm thinking, man, this is good stuff. I think that this resonates with me. I think it resonates with what I see about people. And yet, how do I know that this is actually biblical? Because if this is not substantiated biblically, then Pascal is wrong. And if he's wrong, then we could just throw the whole thing away. Okay? Just wasted 30 minutes of your time listening to all that explanation if Pascal was wrong about this anthropology. But if he's right, if his explanation of the human condition is confirmed by the biblical data, it could provide an even more compelling explanation for the human existence that is rooted in Christian theology. And this is what I'm getting at here now. If Pascal is right, we'll be able to go to the Bible and see, yes, that's what the Bible does teach about human beings. If Pascal is right, then we'll be able to go to the most important statement about what a human being is, and that is the statements that have to do with humans being created in the image of God, and that would confirm what Pascal is saying. If it doesn't, we just need to throw away that whole approach and find a different one. All right, so what I wanted to know, and what I think we should be curious to know is what Pascal is saying about the human condition, is it corroborated biblically? And this takes us to part 2. Okay, so part 1, I wanted you to understand the Pascal's approach to Christian persuasion. It's an approach I think that many people fail to understand because most people conflate it with Pascal's wager, and they think that was his major contribution to apologetics, when in fact, Pascal was really what he was doing is focusing on the human condition and helping his readers understand that their condition is such that can be explained only through Christian theology. And now we're moving on to part 2. We're asking the question, how does this connect with the biblical theological theme of the Imago Dei? And to do that, what I want to do is explain to you what is meant by the teaching that human beings were created in the image of God. And to do that, I will take my Bible and we will go to Genesis 1:26 and 27. Now, this is a very well-known passage in which people call it the Divine Deliberation. God is deciding to create human beings and explaining how he will do so. Genesis 1:26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Verse 27, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." That is the most important passage on the teaching that human beings were created in the image of God. So I'm going to give you 5 statements about what it means that humans were created in the image of God, and this will fill out our understanding of the Bible's teaching about the Imago Dei, so that then we can go back and see, does this confirm or disconfirm what Pascal is saying about the human condition? Does it corroborate or does it weaken his case? Does it make us think, wow, that is a powerful apologetic tool, or no, he didn't get it quite right. We're going to have to move on to something else. So we're going to see if the features of the teaching about the doctrine of the Imago Dei, if they map onto Pascal's anthropology as an explanation for the human condition. And just stated differently, does the teaching of the Imago Dei, does it help explain the tensions that we feel within ourselves? Okay, so let me go through these 5 statements about what it means that we're created in the image of God. I may get through part of these before we'll take our break. But first of all, to be created in the image of God means that human beings are fundamentally relational. It means that human beings are fundamentally relational. This is very clear from the wording. Simply the fact that human beings are made in God's image means that who we are cannot be understood unless it's understood in relation to something else. So what a human being is unintelligible. What we are as human beings is unintelligible apart from our relationship to something else. Fundamentally, ontologically, core to our identity as human beings is a relationship. And the relationship, first of all, is with God. So man is made in the image of God. Now, what does it mean then for us to be fundamentally related to God? We find a little further light shed on this in Genesis chapter 5. There are 2 terms, they're synonyms, the Hebrew synonyms tselem and demuth, that means image and likeness. We find those same words, the same terms, in Genesis 5, verse 3. Now, I'll catch this up from verse 1. "This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created." Now listen to this, the same words, tselem and demuth, image and likeness, that were used in Genesis 1:26 and 27, are now used in Genesis 5:3. "When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth." So the same terms that describe the relationship between Adam and his son, the same terms that describe the relationship between father and son, also describe the relationship between God and humanity. So there is a very strong connection between bearing the image of God and being a descendant of God, being offspring of God, being a son of God. In fact, the word sonship is a good way of summarizing or explaining what this concept of being created in the image of God really means. So, the relationship that we are constituted for, ontologically, fundamentally to our nature, is first of all a relationship with God that can be described as a father-son relationship. We see that confirmed then in Genesis 5:3. Now, the relationship is not only a vertical relationship between God and human beings, but there's another component to this relationship. So we're fundamentally constituted for a relationship between with God, but there is a horizontal aspect to this. Go back to Genesis 1:26, and you notice that it says, on the heels of God, the divine deliberation, let us make man in our image after our likeness. There, I'm reading from the ESV, there's a sentence break there, and then it goes on and says, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. But scholars of the Hebrew language have noted that this verb, and let them have dominion, carries a purpose function from going back to God's deliberation to let us make, so that we can read this almost as follows. Let us make man in our image after our likeness, so that they may have dominion. So our having been created in the image of God, fundamentally related to God in a relationship that can be described as sonship, has as its purpose or as its result a secondary relationship between human beings and the rest of the created order. So I'm saying that what it means to be created in the image of God means to be fundamentally constituted for a relationship, and that relationship is both vertical with God, but it is also horizontal. Now, the horizontal relationship, I said that the vertical relationship between God and man is best described by the word sonship. The horizontal relationship can best be encapsulated by the word dominion. Toward God, we are to be submitted as sons. That's what human beings are meant to do. We're to be aligned in a relationship with God as a son would with his father. We're to represent, there's an idea of representation there as well, representing God as a son would bear likeness to and thus represent his father. And yet, as it relates to the rest of the universe, we're supposed to have dominion. Now, the purpose of this two-directional relationship between God and humans and the rest of the created order is best encapsulated by the word represent. So we bear God's image so that we can represent God to the rest of the created order, and we do that by exercising dominion. So that first point then is this. What it means to be created in the image of God is that we are fundamentally relational. And then underneath that relationship goes two directions, toward God, toward the rest of the creation. Sonship, dominion, encapsulated by the word represent. Represent. Here is the second statement I'll make about what it means to be created in the image of God, or the filling out or understanding of the image of God. And that is this. Sin perverts expressions of our bearing God's image. Sin perverts expressions of our bearing God's image. So, I said that what it means to bear the image of God means to have a relationship with God that's described as sonship, and have a relationship with the rest of the universe that is best described by dominion. But what we see happening because of sin, we see these relationships being distorted. Think about what happened when the serpent tempted Eve. As an image bearer, Eve's responsibility was to represent God to the serpent as part of the creation by exercising dominion over the serpent. That was what Eve was supposed to do. That's what Adam was supposed to do. Adam and Eve were supposed to exercise dominion over the serpent by representing God to that serpent. But think about what happened instead. They allowed the serpent to misrepresent God to them, thus worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. Here is a perversion of the God-intended purpose of humans bearing His image. rather than representing God to the creature, they're allowing the creature to represent God, or more accurately, misrepresent God to them, and thus they are defying that sonship relationship that they ought to bear. That's why Paul in Romans chapter 1 is saying that instead of worshiping and serving the Creator, they've switched it, they flipped it, they perverted it, and now the created things get worshipped, and the creature doesn't get worshipped. So sin perverts expressions of our bearing the image of God. We see this also, evidence also of this in the New Testament, when in the epistles, Colossians and Ephesians, and also there's some passages in 2 Corinthians, we'll get to that later, that talk about the need for a renewed image of God. So while the Scripture doesn't expressly say that the image of God has been distorted, it does imply that the need exists, otherwise there would be no need for the image to be restored in human beings. Now, we have to be very careful with our terminology here, because in fact, many scholars on this whole topic of the image of God, many reputable scholars have put it in these words. They've said the image of God is erased, or the image of God is defaced. Calvin puts it this way: the image of God is vitiated, or the image of God is marred. They use these terminologies. The danger of, the reason I've used the term very carefully, I've used the term perverted, because I want to make it clear that there is no diminishing of the image of God in any human being whatsoever. Every human is an image bearer of God. There are no degrees of image bearing. Every human being, no matter how sinful, is as much an image bearer as any other human being, no matter how righteous. You think, how in the world can that be? Especially Martin Luther himself defined the image of God as original righteousness. And yet we find it very clear that in later parts of post-fall, Genesis 9:6, what was the reason given for capital punishment? The reason for capital punishment was because human beings are created in the image of God. The image of God language is repeated before or after the fall. After the fall. What does that teach us? That sin did not remove the image of God in human beings. We find another occurrence of the reference to the image of God in the epistle of James. James talks about the dangers of gossip and tearing each other down, and he says, you shouldn't talk about people like that. You shouldn't slander people like that. Why? Because they're created in the image of God. Is that before or after the fall? It's after the fall. So what we have to understand it very clearly is that bearing God's image, all humans bear God's image, no matter how sinful. The reason why it's important to understand that is because if there are varying degrees of bearing the image of God, that means some people are less human than others. I mean, some people we might treat as less of a human than others because, well, they don't exhibit the image of God as fully as these people. Those people are better image bearers. Those people are really bear the image of God. So they should be treated. No, every human, this is the foundation of human dignity. This is the foundation of human worth. This is foundational to many of our convictions, even as a Western civilization, that in each, there is inherent worth in each human being. Where do we get that? The image of God. Image of God is universal. It's in every human being. It's not removed, vitiated, defaced, erased, marred in any way. And yet, what has sin done? It takes those expressions of imagedness and it perverts them for self-serving ends. The best illustration that I have of this is of the prodigal son. This actually, we read of this in a book by Emil Brunner. He's talking about, or Emil Brunner, he's talking about the image of God. He uses this as an illustration. So the prodigal son, he's far away from his father. He is in a foreign land. He's wishing he could eat the food that was meant for the pigs. And he comes to himself, and I'm quoting from Luke 15:17, he says, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger?" Now, what exactly was it that made the son's condition so miserable? It was not merely the fact that he was hungry. It was not merely the fact that he was engaged in feeding swine, an animal that would have been repugnant to the Jewish people. That was bad, but that was not the thing that exacerbated his misery. The thing that exacerbated his misery was this. He was a son. He wasn't supposed to be there. His father, he was his father's son. So here's where the parallel exists. His sonship was not marred, vitiated, destroyed, effaced, erased by his distance. It was his sonship that actually made his distance all the worse. So now you may be beginning to see, okay, there's similarities between what Pascal is doing and the image of God, right? Pascal is saying, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but our very craving for happiness reveals that there is happiness to be had, and that happiness to be had makes us feel all the more miserable that we don't have it. So the fact that we are created in the image of God, it makes the condition that we're in all the worse. And yet we cannot say, exegetically, biblically, from a biblical theological perspective, that the image of God is lessened or diminished in any human being whatsoever. Rather, we're careful to say that the expressions of these imaginess, of the image-bearing nature of human beings are perverted. Where do we see this? We see this in relationships, with our relationship with God. We see it in what God meant us to be. We see it in our behavior. In every way, we see that we are what we should be doing because of our being constituted for a relationship with God, and the rest of the creation we are failing to do. All right, it's 5 till 2. Let me just recap where I am. What we're talking about, to this point, is I've given you an overview of Blaise Pascal's approach to Christian persuasion, in which he wants to make his readers understand that there's such a paradoxical tension that they crave for an explanation. The explanation can be found only in Christian anthropology. And then what I'm in the middle of right now is talking about the image of God, because what we're going to do is we're going to see, does the teaching about the image of God, does it match with Pascal's anthropology, and therefore does it constitute an even more compelling case for the Christian faith? So we're going to stop there, and Ben, would you just wrap things up here?
Thank you very much, Dr. Threlfall. I hope this has been helpful to you so far. Looking forward to the second session. We'll take about a 10-minute break. We'll actually start back up at 2:05. And so we'll start back up at 2:05, and we'll see you guys in just a little bit.
Okay, we are in the middle of these 5 points that we're making to help explain the meaning of the image of God, what it means that human beings are created in the image of God. We've gotten through the first 2 points, and that is that human beings, being created in the image of God, means that human beings are fundamentally relational. And that relationship proceeds in 2 directions, the vertical toward God and the horizontal toward the rest of the cosmos. The vertical relationship can be described as sonship, the horizontal as dominion, and the purpose of this dual relationship is representation. It's to represent, so humans can represent God to the rest of the cosmos. The second point has thrown a monkey wrench into that whole first point because it states that sin has perverted expressions of this, are having the image of God. And because of that, we illustrated that with the prodigal son. At a distance from the father, his sonship was what made his distance even worse. And so we find that our condition is made all the worse, or our awareness of it, by the fact that we are indeed created in the image of God. So we'll look at the third point here, and that is this, that our bearing the image of God and our sinfulness, so those 2 components of our condition, being created in the image of God, but now our sinfulness, taken together, they render the human condition paradoxical. So I'll say that again. Bearing the image of God and being a sinner, those 2 conditions render the human condition paradoxical. And that is that we humans, stand in this paradoxical condition of being constituted for a relationship with one whom we have rejected, intended for a telos for which we have made ourselves unfit, and accountable to norms that we have violated. One theologian, Gerald Bray, has put it this way: the presence of the image is the presence of responsibility, which is at the same time the glory and the tragedy of fallen Adam. So this is our condition. And even as redeemed image bearers, this is the reality, that we still have this paradoxical condition because of our having been created in the image of God and yet having fallen into sin. Okay? That's a brief point. The first and second were rather long because I had to explain exegetically the reason why I was expressing those points the way I did. But that brings us to the fourth point, and that is that this paradoxical condition, the paradoxical condition that I referred to, brought about by our bearing the image of God but being sinners, it has certain implications for how we process information, for our minds. I'll put it this way: this paradoxical condition has epistemic implications. By epistemic, of course, we mean the study of how we know, the study of knowledge. Throughout Scripture, particularly in the New Testament, the Scripture speaks of the cognitive effects of the fall. For example, Hebrews 3, verse 13 speaks of the deceitfulness of sin. That is, sin and its effect of making us believe something that is untrue. It speaks of the futile, darkened, blinded minds of unbelievers. It speaks of the danger of self-deception. It speaks of the devil as the father of lies. All these words, futile, darkened, blinded, deceitfulness, lies, all these have to do with our cognition, our noetic abilities. And so there are implications for us having fallen into sin, and our sinfulness affects our minds. We see this in a positive light in the descriptions for turning to salvation, or turning to God. When a person turns away from their sin, a metaphor for that is turning toward the light or walking in the light. We have this contrast between the wisdom of this age and the wisdom of God. There's this cognitive thing going on here. Believers have received, this is Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 2:12, the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given to us about God. Now, how has sin affected our bearing the image of God with respect to our cognitive abilities? Well, if you think about it, going back to the very first point, that is that what it means to be human as an image bearer means to be fundamentally constituted for a relationship with God. Now, to have a relationship with God, we must have some understanding of who God is. But because of our sinfulness, it guarantees that we don't understand who God is. But we continue to form beliefs about who God is. In other words, we continue to form beliefs about whatever we are related to vertically, but those beliefs are never true. That's why Paul writes in Romans 1:19, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, and yet, even though it's plain to them, we continue to not, even though it's plain to people who observe the creation, they continue to worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator." Another example of this is from the book of Acts, when we read that the Athenians were worshiping the unknown God. They have this impulse, as every human being does, to believe something about what is above them, something about that being to whom they are intended to have a relationship with, and yet because of their fallenness, they've rejected that. Those beliefs are going to be false. We see this from the very beginning, the desire for humans to deceive themselves or to hide or to veil or mask their condition. Adam and Eve's first response to the realization that they were morally vulnerable, their nakedness, was to hide, was to seek refuge behind fig leaves and bushes in the garden. So the fact is that we remain beings. Just because we've fallen into sin doesn't mean we no longer bear the image of God. It means that our bearing the image of God has been distorted in this respect. We continue to form beliefs about what is above us, but those beliefs are wrong. We have other writers referring to the same idea. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga writes about the noetic effects of the fall. He says, God has created us human beings in his own image. This centrally involves our resembling God in being persons, that is, in being humans, beings with intellect and will. But as a consequence of the fall, Plantinga writes, quote, our original knowledge of God and of his marvelous beauty, glory, and loveliness has been severely compromised. We no longer know God in the same natural and unproblematic way in which we know each other and the world around us. So there's this self-deception, there's this self-contradiction. Now, under this same point, and that is that this paradoxical condition has these epistemic consequences, we find emerging, we can't get away from this, that once we start talking about the doctrine and image of God, it inevitably leads us to Christology. So we see now, if you like systematic theology, you'll begin to see the interrelatedness of these major categories of systematic theology. So we started with anthropology. So I'm talking about apologetics, and yet apologetics cannot be done rightly without systematic theology. So you've got anthropology, and Pascal has drawn upon these features of the human condition that in which he says humans are created for God but have fallen from God. We're substantiating that exegetically from this biblical theological theme of the Imago Dei, and now we immediately converge upon another category in systematic theology, and that is Christology. Why do these two connect? Because the Bible teaches us that Christ is the true image of God. So if you think about it, Christ is then, if we understood the image of God correctly as a being that is constituted for relationship with God and humanity, Christ is the one who actually does that perfectly. So Christ being the true image of God means that Christ is the true Son of God. Remember we said that the word that best describes the relationship between God and humans is son, is the word sonship. Well, we didn't do such a good job of that at all. We destroyed that, or we marred that relationship. And yet, Jesus Christ comes as the true Son of God. And this is incredibly interesting to realize this, that Luke, in Luke's gospel, he traces the genealogy of Christ back all the way to the very beginning, and then he ends that genealogy with saying Adam, who was the Son of God. Okay? And yet, Jesus himself appears as the true Son of God, who did perfectly what Adam failed to do. And that is really live as God's Son and really live as God's representative. And so that one day, Jesus, as the true image of God, will perfectly exercise dominion over all the cosmos. All right? You're seeing that dual relationality, the horizontal and the vertical and the horizontal. And Jesus now, being the true image of God, is the one who restores those who fail to properly bear the image of God or properly express their having borne the image of God. So here's how this connects with our epistemic faculties, with our cognitive abilities. When a fallen image bearer believes in Jesus, the true image of God, that begins a process of cognitive restoration that begins with finally that person admitting the truth about God and him or herself. As fallen image bearers, we cannot stand the truth of God. We cannot stand to admit that we are sinners and God is righteous. We simply cannot do it. It's repugnant to our very being. But a person who believes in Jesus Christ, the true image of God, finally it comes to the point where they realize the truth, that God is righteous and that God is holy and what God expects of them. And not only who God is, but also who humans are. Because Jesus reveals not only God as he is, but human beings as they should be. So when a person believes in Jesus, a person is both understanding who God is and who human beings should be. What that does for our cognitive apparatus is it gets us to finally admit we're sinners and we need a Savior. It gets us to admit that we are completely lost without God. Now the process of cognitive restoration can begin. We see this throughout the Scripture. So that's why, for instance, Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, that as we behold Him, we are transformed from one degree of glory to the next. That's the same context in which he talks about Christ being the image of God. This is such an important passage to our understanding of the Imago Dei and the role of Jesus Christ in perfectly fulfilling that I want to read it to you. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. When Paul says, "And we all," this is verse 18, "with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another." Now I'm going to skip down here to chapter 4 and verse 4. He's speaking of those who are deluded, those whose epistemic apparatus is malfunctioning, those who are, he talks about the gospel is veiled to those who are perishing. Now verse 4, he says, "In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing." Now before I read on, I want you to listen for terminology of the Imago Dei and how Jesus Christ can restore the epistemic apparatus of those who believe in Him. "The light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." Now, that is the clearest statement in all the Bible that brings together anthropology and Christology and the doctrine of the Imago Dei. We see that it converges right here. Where is the hope of us ever bearing the image of God properly as we were meant to? Where is the hope that we will actually be who we were meant to be as image bearers? Here it is. It's beholding the glory of Jesus Christ. Right? That's where the restoration begins, because Jesus is the true image of God. Now, the author of Hebrews, I'm going to turn to Hebrews chapter 1, uses the Greek word charakter in a very similar way to the Greek word icon, which is we get the English word icon from it. It's translated image. He uses it to a similar effect when he writes in Hebrews chapter 1, and I'll read this to you. "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son." There's the language of sonship. That should remind you of the dominant theme of that vertical relationship of bearing the image of God, sonship, "whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature, and He upholds the universe by the word of His power." Now there we see what, again, themes having to do with the Imago Dei, that vertical relationship, the sonship, the horizontal relationship, dominion, the exact representation of God. That is what Jesus Christ does. And those who believe in Him finally come to the truth about themselves and God. So, let me recap here. What are we learning about what it means to be created in the image of God? It means that we are ontologically, fundamentally relational beings. That relationship proceeds in two directions, toward God and the rest of the universe. Sin perverts expressions of our bearing the image of God. In other words, sin perverts the way that we express that. It doesn't mar, it doesn't distort, it doesn't destroy it. Our having been created in the image of God and our sinfulness conspire to render our condition paradoxical. This has epistemic implications. And finally, number 5, that those epistemic implications are being restored in believers. Okay, I've gotten ahead of myself and already started talking about that. Okay, we were talking about Jesus Christ as being the true image bearer, the true Son of God, and now this begins to be restored in human beings. What does this mean? This means that humans, in our beliefs and in our behavior, will begin to exhibit true righteousness and holiness. That's what Paul is talking about when he's in Ephesians chapter 4. He's saying that we need to bear the new person, the new man who was created in the image of God in true righteousness and holiness. It involves restoration of our cognitive apparatus in how we perceive God and ourselves and in our behavior. So, let me just try to summarize this for you. The Scripture's teaching on the image of God. And I'll read this paragraph. Fallen humans remain image bearers. As an immutable feature of our nature, imagedness, that is our having been created in the image of God, cannot be eradicated, corrupted, or marred. We are ineradicably constituted for a relationship with God as His children and with creation as God's representatives. But the expressions of imagedness have been thoroughly perverted by sin. As fallen image bearers, our relationships have gone awry. We fail to submit to God and fulfill His expectations. Our knowledge of God and others has malfunctioned. We form false beliefs about God and others. Nevertheless, these two features of human nature, sinfulness and bearing the image of God, conspire to render us paradoxical. They coexist in fallen human nature. And they together say and help us understand that who we are as human beings, fallen human beings, is this fundamental tension between greatness and wretchedness, happiness and unhappiness, significance and insignificance. All right? So, if you've been tracking with me, you'll see that what we've come back to is this. Remember, I asked the question, does Pascal's Anthropology map onto a biblical theology of the Imago Dei? And we see, yes, it does. You look at Pascal's Anthropology, human beings are a paradoxical duality of greatness and wretchedness. You look at what we learn from the Imago Dei, same thing right here, except in a more powerful way, in more detail. Absolutely, yes, we are paradoxical. We do bear this tension between greatness and wretchedness. So we can take a deep breath and say, okay, this is a legitimate way of Christian persuasion. This does have exegetical and biblical theological substantiation, and moreover, maybe this could make what Pascal was saying even more powerful. Because the interesting thing is this, going back to why when I wrote my dissertation and why I wrote these couple articles for some journals, Pascal was an amazing exegete of human nature, but he was not a biblical theologian. He was not a biblical. He didn't take time to exegete Scripture, and that's why I begin to think, well, maybe if we actually do the spade work in the Bible and see does a Christian anthropology support his apologetic approach, and realize, well, yes, it does. But I think it even does better than what Pascal did, because the things that the image of God point out are I think far more compelling. And so this moves us on now to the third section of these talks. Okay, so what I wanted to do first of all, and I hope that I've been able to accomplish this, is now you have a better understanding of what Blaise Pascal, how he was trying to argue for Christianity, trying to make people wish Christianity were true by showing them these tensions that they feel to be true within themselves, and then proving that it is true. And the way he shows us these tensions is by saying, hey, don't you want to be happy? Well, you can't not want to be happy, but you can't be happy. So yeah, have fun trying that. You want certainty. You feel like there's some sense of truth, but you can never feel like you grasp it. There's another evidence of it. You feel really insignificant and you feel significant. All that makes you say, help me, what's going on here? Give me an explanation. Pascal says, here it is, Christian anthropology. And then what I've done is taken you to the doctrine of the image of God and says, yeah, this does bear out in Scripture. This does bear out when we look at the doctrine of the Imago Dei. Now, what I want to do is this. I want to show you how when we combine the doctrine of the image of God and a Pascalian approach to Christian persuasion, the result is a even more powerful apologetic. And I'll demonstrate that in a number of ways. remember I explained to you about this whole thing of abductive reasoning. So reasoning the best explanation. So if the Imago Dei and our sinfulness, if that is the best explanation for the human condition, it should explain some other things that we see around us. And I'm going to point out some of those things in terms of our behavior and our beliefs. Here's the question that I want to ask. How does the Imago Dei help us explain human behavior and beliefs? Because there are certain things that human beings do that are just absolutely absurd and bizarre. No one would argue with the fact that humans believe absurd things and behave in bizarre ways. Like that, you know that about yourself. Everybody knows that. Humans do that. The question is, why? So I've selected some behaviors that humans do that demand an explanation, and then I'm going to point to the Imago Dei as being the explanation. Okay, let's go to something that Sigmund Freud pointed out. These are what he calls the life instinct and the death drive. Okay, we're looking at behaviors. We're looking at absurd, irrational, weird, paradoxical human behaviors. And one of them is something that Sigmund Freud noticed. Life instinct and death drive. So early in his career, Freud recognized that all living things, including human beings, have this thing that he called this life drive. He called it the eros, E-R-O-S, eros. We're familiar with that Greek word for love. We get the word erotic from it. So he used it to describe what he sees as every living things they have an impulse for life. That doesn't seem very controversial to us. Everything we do, or much of what we do, is driven by a desire to live. Simple. And yet, later on in his career, he began to see something else in nature and in human beings that he couldn't reconcile with this life drive, and he called it the death drive. It was this impulse to be self-destructive. And he began to see this in everything. He began to see there's a life drive and there's a death drive. In fact, he wrote this in the book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Listen to this. Only by concurrent and mutually opposing action of these two primal instincts, eros and the death instinct, and never by one or the other alone, can we explain the rich multiplicity of the phenomena of life. What he's saying is this. Whenever you look at life, you can't just say, well, everything has an impulse for life, because you have to look at the fact that for some reason, even human beings have an impulse for death. That is, for some reason, we engage in self-destructive behavior. One of Freud's followers, Karl Menninger, wrote this: whoever studies the behavior of human beings cannot escape the conclusion that we must reckon with an enemy within the lines. It becomes increasingly evident that some of the destruction which curses the earth is self-destruction. The extraordinary propensity of the human being to join hands with external forces in an attack upon his own existence is one of the most remarkable of biological phenomena. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes absolutely no sense. If the survival of the fittest is the explanation for the human condition, it seems like this impulse for self-destruction would have gone away a long time ago. And yet, for some reason, human beings still exhibit this tendency. Where do we see this tendency? Think about the earliest human artifacts that we find. They are farming tools and tools for warfare. That is life, farming, and warfare, death. We kill each other. We see this most remarkably in war. It is most remarkable that human beings summon their most technologically advanced inventions to destroy themselves. In fact, this is a letter from Albert Einstein to Freud. I'll read this quotation from this letter to you. Albert Einstein wrote this letter to Sigmund Freud. He says this. This is in light of the world wars. How is it possible for the ruling minority to force the masses to observe a purpose which rewards them only with suffering and loss? Why do the masses permit themselves to be inflamed to the point of madness and self-sacrifice by these means? Here's his question. Do hatred and destruction satisfy an innate human drive which ordinarily remains latent but which can easily be aroused? Einstein's looking at this and he's thinking, why are we killing ourselves? Why are we using our highest achievements for self-destruction? Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this is hard to fit into an evolutionary framework. But when you consider that human beings were created in the image of God, constituted for a relationship with God, the source of life, but have, because of their sin, cut themselves off from it, then we can expect to see this death impulse all around us. We could expect to see human beings engaging in self-destructive, addictive behavior. We could expect to see this. It's not a surprise to us. It fits perfectly within our worldview. It's no surprise. Why? Because we know that human beings are created in the image of God, so we're capable of doing incredibly great things, like technology. And yet we know that human beings are sinners, and so we could expect for us to use that technology to destroy ourselves. It's just what we would expect. It's just like Sherlock Holmes expecting to see the muddy knees of the employee's trousers because it fit the framework of his explanation. That's what the doctrine of the Imago Dei does with respect to Freud's life instinct and death instinct. Let me give you another example. And this comes from the area of altruism and selfishness. How do you explain the fact that some human beings manage to express such altruistic tendencies, doing something just totally disinterested for the sake of somebody else? I just do it because I love them, and it's no benefit to me. At the same time, that same human being can be incredibly selfish. What gives? I'll give you a really crazy example of this. There was a man named Bob Davies in World War II. He was part of a bomb squad, and Bob Davies would go in and extract bombs that had fallen in London at great personal risk. Now, there was one bomb that fell dangerously close to St. Paul's Cathedral. It sunk itself 28 feet into the ground. Bob Davies was part of the crew that extracted this. The thing about these cruel bombs is that they were designed so that when you tried to get to it, it would explode. It wouldn't explode on impact. It would explode when the bomb squad got to it, or it'd explode sometime afterwards. It's terribly dangerous, terribly cruel. He managed to get it out far away from anybody. It was detonated safely. Now, Bob Davies was considered a hero for all that he did. And yet, less than 2 years later, he was court-martialed because he was extracting exorbitant cash payments to people. While he was engaged in these acts of apparent heroism, he was using the situation to his own advantage. And so you look at this situation, and you're like, how can a guy do something like this? You have this bizarre mixture of altruism and selfishness, and this is what Max Hastings wrote this brilliant history of World War II. He says this at the conclusion of the story about Bob Davies. A lesson of his story was that scoundrels as well as heroes played their parts in the Blitz, and some people were a tangle of both at the same time in the same actions. It's not just that 1 year Bob Davies did something great, 2 years later he did something evil. He did something evil and great in the very same action. I mean, how do you explain this except human beings are a paradoxical duality of greatness and wretchedness, bearing the image of God and having fallen into sin? All right, so I give you two examples. We're talking about the Imago Dei as being a powerful explanatory explanation for these tensions within the human nature. And we looked at two behaviors, one pointed out by Freud, one we see example of. Let me give you one more in the area of altruism and selfishness. Excuse me. And that is in philanthropy. It would seem that some people, in giving money to other people to help a great cause, would be acting out of selflessness. And yet one great problem, you research this, one great problem with philanthropy, they call it disruptive philanthropy, which gifts are actually can harm something by by influencing decisions or by merely leveraging a certain personality, or even by simply being gratifying, self-gratifying to the person who gives it. So we ask, is it possible for a human being to be truly altruistic? Is it possible for a human being to be only selfish? Well, the fact is, we don't need to choose between both, because by nature of our being created in the image of God and being sinners, we're capable of both. We're capable of doing some really altruistic things and doing some selfish things, and we could do them in the same actions. Okay, those are behavior. Those are some examples of behaviors that are explained by our being created in the image of God. Let me give you some examples of some beliefs that are explained by our having been created in the image of God. Why is it that human beings seem unable to agree on not only whether God exists, but if they do what they are? I think I said that right. So why do we have so many conflicting ideas about who God is? It would seem that if God exists, then people would know who he is or know that he is. And if he didn't exist, then it would be very clear. Well, the fact is that because of our having fallen, because of our being created in the image of God, and actually this is a problem for a lot of anthropologists. I'm talking about not theological anthropologists, I'm talking about secular anthropologists, the whole discipline of anthropology. Why is it that cultural anthropology, why do people believe in gods? Richard Dawkins would say that this was a evolutionary glitch, a misfiring that had some useful advantage in prehistory, but now it doesn't really advantage us anymore. But as we look at this whole issue, this question of, okay, why do people believe in the gods? It makes total sense within an Imago Dei framework, because we're constituted for a being above us. We're constituted to have some relationship with God, and yet, and then you might conclude, if you're only looking at our being created in the image of God, you'll say, well, then we should know that God exists. Everybody should have total proof of this. Well, no. Why? Because there's another factor of human nature to consider, and that is our sinfulness. So our imagedness, that is our being created in the image of God, and our sinfulness conspire to guarantee that we will, on the one hand, believe that there is a God, and on the other hand, that we can't agree on what it is. Why? Because our knowledge about that God is guaranteed to be false apart from special revelation, specifically Jesus Christ, the image of God. That's why it's not just that this culture over here believes that there are many gods. This culture over here believes that there's one God. You have the Greeks and their pantheon. You have the Jews and their monotheism. You have the Zoroastrianisms and their duotheism. It's not simply that. It's that the same individual can believe one thing about God one day and another thing about God the other day, or even simultaneously be like, well, I know there's got to be some God, but I don't know whether there's one or many. Why in the world is that? Why, it's simple. It's because our knowledge of God will never be correct, will never be right, and yet we will always have some persistent belief that there is a God. There are a lot of writings about postmodern American culture, post-Christian American culture. Why is it that we still seem haunted by some sense of some transcendence? Why do we believe? Why cannot we shake ourselves of the belief in God? Well, from an Imago Dei perspective, there's no problem with that. On the other hand, why can't we agree that there is a God? Well, from the Imago Dei perspective, there's no problem with that either. It explains both poles of that duality. So, we're looking at paradoxical beliefs. One is why people can't agree on the nature of God. Another one, and these are beliefs that are explained by the Imago Dei, another one is this whole idea of self-knowledge. So, you've probably heard the Delphic oracle, know thyself. This is a theme that goes back to ancient days. But if you think about it, why do we have such a quest to know ourselves? It's actually a paradoxical command. this is the theme of many movies, the popular movies. The protagonist is trying to find out who or she is, who am I? But if you think about it, if you found yourself, how would you know that you found yourself if you didn't know who you were to begin with? If you're looking for your key to your car and you found a Toyota key, but you could know that's not yours if you drive a Honda, but how are you going to know if you found yourself if the one seeking is the one who is lost? So this whole idea of knowing ourselves, know thyself, is a paradoxical command. Why then can humans not quit this whole hunt for who they are? Charles Taylor says, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor says, self-exploration is central to our culture. Does the Imago Dei have anything to say about this phenomenon? Yes, it does. Why? Because we are relational creatures, fundamentally constituted to have a relationship with God. To be a relational creature, you must have some degree of self-knowledge. You must know who you are so that you can properly relate to someone who is not you. But because we have fallen into sin, that is our sinfulness, we now do not have a right concept of who we are. In fact, that's one of the themes of sinfulness. It's self-deceit. We are deceived about who we are. Now, because we are self-deceived, that explains the constant human quest for self-knowledge. Why? Because we are cut off from who we are. This is why I love these words that Calvin says near the opening of his Institutes. He says, "It is evident that man never attains to true self-knowledge until he has contemplated the face of God and come down after such contemplation to look into himself. For such is our innate pride that we always seem to ourselves just and upright and wise and holy until we are convinced by clear evidence of our injustice, vileness, folly, and impurity." You see, we could only know ourselves if we know God, but because of our being created in the image of God and our being sinners, it guarantees that our self-knowledge itself will be distorted. Okay, I'm going to move quickly here because I have some more ground to cover. We've seen then how the doctrine of the image of God helps explain paradoxical behavior, paradoxical beliefs. But now let me just pose this question. What about those of you who are believers? You might say, okay, now this is really cool because this helps me speak into the culture. This helps me explain some things that are going on. And yet, what does this mean for me personally? I believe in Jesus Christ. I've seen Jesus as the image of God. Does that mean this tension is resolved for me? The answer is, no, it's not. Because even though you're an image bearer, you bear the image of God, now you're redeemed. You've seen the true image of God, and the process for being conformed to the image of God has begun. That does not solve your problem, I'm sorry to say. It will eventually. It will eventually. John writes in his first epistle that when we see him, we'll be like him, for we will see him as he is. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8 that we will be fully conformed to the image of his Son. That is the glory that he's talking about, a glory that is so worth that the creation is groaning for it, right? Yet, in this life, being a fallen image bearer who believes in Jesus Christ, it actually makes it a little worse in this respect. Now that we've seen who we should be, it makes us even more dissatisfied with who we are right now. This is exactly why, and I want to explain this to you from Romans chapter 8. This is exactly why Paul says that we groan inwardly, right? And again, I'm speaking to those who believe in Jesus Christ and realizing, okay, for a fallen image bearer, we have these tensions within ourselves, and yet once we have believed in Jesus Christ, the tension is actually heightened. Romans chapter 8, verse 23 says this, "Not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit." Let me pause just a minute. Paul has mentioned the creation. The creation is that over which human beings are intended to have dominion, but have failed to exercise dominion. Therefore, not only the creation itself is groaning until human beings reach that for which God intends them, and that is the glory of Christ-likeness. So creation itself cannot reach its eschatological telos until human beings are fully conformed to the image of Christ, thus able to exercise the dominion that God intended for them. Now, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit. What is the Spirit? And I'll pause there again. What is the Spirit saying? Well, earlier in Romans chapter 8, Paul had said, the Spirit is bearing witness with our spirit that we are the sons of God. I'm using that son, I want to remind you, the sonship language. We are the sons of God. The Spirit saying, you're a son of God. You're a daughter of God. Does that make you happy? Well, of course it makes you happy, but it also makes you groan. Why? Because in this life, you know that you're not everything you should be. You know that the Christoformity, the Christ-likeness that has begun at your conversion is now creating in you such an agony and attention to want that process to be completed. That's why Paul writes, he says, not only we ourselves, the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons. Okay, there's the sonship language, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. I'm going to skip down to verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. So for a redeemed, fallen image bearer, that's just a long way of saying anybody who's a Christian, a true Christian right now, the process of Christ-likeness creates and stirs within us an even greater tension. Now, I'm instead of taking the time to exegete some passages that speak of that, I will move on to seeing this instantiated in the lives of three well-known Christians who have recorded some of their thoughts and with respect to the Christian life. Very briefly, Augustine, C.S. Lewis, and Jonathan Edwards. So what I'm saying here is being a image bearer who is being conformed into the image of Christ does not solve all the tensions. It creates some new ones, and yet the overall tenor of a person's life is going to be toward Christ-likeness. So this process of Christ-likeness begins when God begets, again, notice the sonship terminology, a believer as a new self in Christ. We see this in 2 Corinthians 5:17. If anyone is in Christ, he has a new creation. This Christ-likeness is inceptive. So it begins embryonically. It is this already, we can see this already not yet tension that we see in biblical theology at play in this sanctification. All right, you just sidebar, again, going back to systematic theology, we're seeing the convergence of anthropology, Christology, and now sanctification as a subcategory of soteriology here. And I can also add eschatology because all this is an already not yet idea here. So this Christ-likeness begins with God when God begets a believer as a new self in Christ. It's inceptive, and third, and this is relevant to our point, it coexists with our fallenness. So our having believed in Jesus Christ as the true image of God, thus gaining an understanding of ourselves and God that is not mingled with self-deception, does not eradicate all self-deception. Why? Even believers are subject to being self-deceived. However, they have new beliefs about God and themselves, they have transformed behavior, and yet they continue to feel the tension between their fallenness and Christoformity. Okay, what about Augustine? And what I want to show you is that Augustine, and I may not get to C.S. Lewis and Jonathan Edwards, but I'll at least start with Augustine. Augustine, he exhibits these characteristics of having, at his conversion, having new beliefs about God and himself, after conversion, transformed behavior, and yet continuing to feel the tension of fallenness and his pursuit of Christ-likeness. So in his Confessions, he laments that his heart had become gross and I had no clear vision even of my own self. Okay, that corresponds perfectly with what we'd expect to see about a fallen image bearer. no right view of myself. Okay, we're created in the image of God, but we lost our self-understanding because of our sinfulness. Again, he says, his duplicity sprang from his, quote, lust for self-justification. That resonates with what Calvin had said about us not being able to stand the fact that we're sinners and God is righteous. All right, so this is pre-conversion for Augustine. At his conversion, he says this, at once, with the last words of this sentence, he's referring to Romans chapter 13, it was as if a light, there's some cognitive change, of relief from all anxiety flooded my heart, all the shadows of doubt were dispelled. And later, his confession of God's nature rings with truth and certainty. This is quoting from Augustine's Confessions. Who then are you, my God? What I ask, but God who is the Lord, most high, utterly good, utterly powerful, most omnipotent, most merciful and most just, deeply hidden, yet most intimately present, perfection of both beauty and strength, stable and incomprehensible, immutable and yet changing all things, never new, never old, making everything new and leading the proud to be old without their knowledge, always supporting and filling and protecting, creating and nurturing and bringing to maturity, searching even though to you nothing is lacking. You love without burning. You are jealous in a way that is free of anxiety. You are wrathful and yet remain tranquil. There is the exaltation of someone who had found rest in God. Right? There is someone who understands who God is. Now, he had once false self-conception, saw the truth about God. That resonates with what we expect to see about someone who has believed in Christ, the true image of God, and yet we'd also expect to see some ongoing tension in his life. And yes, we find that to be the case as well. Augustine, we know, lapsed into, he says, occasional gluttony creeps up on your servant. He admits of his temptation for vain glory, and yet the overall tenor of his life is toward Christ-likeness. We see a similar thing in C.S. Lewis, self-deception about who he was, about who God is, a turning around to see the truth about who God is and who he is, and then a steady progress toward Christ-likeness, but not without its ups and downs. And we see the same thing with Jonathan Edwards. Now, I choose those three Christians because their writing is really good, because they exhibit a great deal of transparency about their personal lives, and because they simply corroborate what we are saying about this whole anthropological argument, this commendation of the Christian faith. We see what we expected to see. The image of God and the fallenness of human beings conspire to render us paradoxical, even for those who are now being transformed into the image of Christ. Now, I'm going to wrap things up here in the time that I have left. What does this mean then for the way that we commend the faith? This takes us back to this fundamental conviction that the best apologetics is simply making clear what the Bible teaches. The best way to commend the Christian faith is to proclaim the Christian faith. The best way to let people see the truth and goodness and beauty of God as it is displayed in the gospel is to just show the fullness of what the Bible teaches in the full range, and it's all its detail. How glorious God is, how fallen human beings are, what God calls human beings to do, the glory of what Christ has done, his sacrifice on the cross. That is the best apologetic. You cannot disentangle biblical theology and apologetics. And this is one area in which I really want to push back on what we see in a lot of apologetic literature. So what we tend to see is this. You've got apologetics way over here, all this logical argument, and all that has its place. And yet, it is separated from biblical theology. What we have to do, I believe, as biblical theologians and as apologists, because every Christian is called to be apologists, we have to see the integration of the two. And what I've attempted to do through this biblical theological theme of the Imago Dei and through this Pascalian approach to Christian persuasion is saying that bringing together biblical theology and apologetics makes both better. You can see the value of the apologetic value of biblical theology, and you can see the biblical theological substantiation of apologetics. These aren't separate. These go hand in hand. Also, not only do I wish to see us apologists become better biblical theologians, and biblical theologians help to see the apologetic value of what they do, but I hope that we can, through this, help us understand the truth, not just the truth, but also the goodness and the beauty of the Christian faith. How is it the Christian faith is true? Well, it resonates with what we know to be true about ourselves. We read in the Bible, this is what God says. And when people believe this and begin living it out, there is the commendation of the goodness of the Christian faith. And these, the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of the Christian faith cannot be separated from each other. So, let me give just briefly 3 points of application, and we could expand on this, but I'll just give these to you as points before we wrap this up. How does this understanding of a Pascalian approach of Christian persuasion, as it integrates with the doctrine of the Imago Dei, how does this help us? Culturally, personally, and pastorally. So culturally, personally, and pastorally. Culturally, this helps us to understand human culture. It helps us to understand why everywhere we look, there are evidences of human greatness and wretchedness at the same time. We shouldn't be surprised that humans wield their technological advances to self-destruction and all kinds of habits that bind us. So it helps us understand the culture, helps us understand ourselves. Maybe it helps you understand your struggle with sanctification. Helps you understand why in your journey toward Christ-likeness you feel such tension between who you are now and who you ought to be. That tension is normal. It is that groaning that Paul says you will experience because the Spirit of God is bearing witness with your spirit that you are a son or daughter of God. And in fact, that it is that very groaning and longing that gives you the faith to see that everything that God is doing in your life, He is doing to bring you to greater Christ-likeness. Culturally, personally, and then pastorally. Knowing this, having a grasp of this kind of anthropology and its integration with the doctrine of the Imago Dei helps us apply the gospel more poignantly to people's lives. And I've used this in my preaching. I've been able to say, speaking to unbelievers, speaking to maybe believers in my congregation, don't you feel the emptiness within you? I mean, don't you feel even, you know that you're created for more than what you're trying to fill yourself with and with your job and even with your family and all your entertainment. Why? What I'm doing is just drawing upon what the Bible is saying about human nature, is that we're created for God but have fallen from God. This has a great potential for our appeal for people to believe in the gospel. We can't even erase. You can go ahead and try it. You cannot erase your longing for happiness. What does this tell us? That there's a void only God can fill, and only Jesus is the one who could bring us to God. So it is true that this, I suggest, I am commending this approach that brings apologetics, specifically Pascal's anthropological approach to persuasion, and the doctrine of the Imago Dei to bear on a more effective and biblically substantiated apologetic. It is as Pascal says, with Jesus Christ, man is free from vice and wretchedness, because in Him lies all our virtue and all our happiness. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Thankful again for the opportunity to have Dr. Threlfall here with us. Certainly appreciated the 2 talks you gave.
It's been great to be here. Thanks for the privilege.
Yeah. Certainly a good challenge for us, and thinking through some of the things that we've compiled some questions from you folks, and so wanted to tease out a little bit of some of what you've said a little bit more. So I want to begin with a question just about Pascal's theology more broadly. Where would you view him in light of the Reformation, his understanding of, justification, those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Peter Kreeft is a Pascalian scholar, and he's written a book called it's on Pascal. He calls it a festooning of Pascal. And in that book, he says that Pascal is too Protestant for Catholics and too Catholic for Protestants. And I think that's a good way to put him, because he was very much in the Catholic Church. And yet he was involved in a movement called Jansenism, which was related to Port Royal on the coast of France. And it was a group of people who were reading Augustine, and they were starting to get into Augustine's understanding of grace and sovereignty. And because of that, Pascal, there's a lot of suspicion on his orthodoxy as a Catholic. And so he was, it's hard to tell because he died so young, where he would have been if he had continued to read and develop. But as it was, there is a place in his pensée where he encourages those who would be seeking Christianity, go ahead, go to Mass, participate in these things, and you may come to faith. So there are many areas of his theology that, as Protestants, we would say he missed it. He wasn't there in his understanding of. He critiques Calvin throughout as well. Yet on his strength is his dissecting of human nature and understanding of anthropology.
So it's kind of related to that. How important would it be for him to have an orthodox understanding of Christianity to be able to use this argument, especially in light of the whole idea of the image of God in man? He would have had the image of God.
That's right, yeah.
And so would he need to have actually even been a genuine Christian for your argument to
would
be
Pascal
valid?
had to have
Right.
been? Not necessarily. I mean, it doesn't require, a person doesn't have to be a genuine Christian in order to speak truth. He could, so yeah, you're right. His personal, I can't vouch for his personal conversion experience, although it seems there was one. He had this night of fire, he calls it, where he calls out to Jesus Christ as his Savior. He says, calls out to God. He says, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of Jesus Christ. So he did come to this point where he marked it as conversion experience, but again, I can't vouch for that.
Yeah. So continuing on, thinking about Pascal, and you mentioned his wagers, what he's
Yes, right.
known
Yeah.
for. How do you think his wager actually fits in with his apologetic in light of what you've said?
Yeah, most likely, the different scholars have tried to piece together what would have been the end project of his pensée, had it become a complete book. And they say it probably would have come near the end, when he would say, okay, you've heard all this, you wish Christianity were true, I've given these proofs as to why it is. Now, isn't it just better, aren't you better off believing it than disbelieving it? So it probably would have just been a last final appeal. The wager doesn't really fall into the category technically as being an argument. It is more of a prudential consideration. That's what people have called it. It's a prudential argument that says, well, it's more prudent to believe than to disbelieve. And it would have been part of his final appeal for people to believe in Christ.
Now, I think I've seen people use the argument in this way of saying it is more rational to believe in Christianity, and yet you don't. And so in some ways that's actually a reflection of how humanity is both rational and irrational.
Right, yes.
What's your thought of that use of the argument?
Yeah, so can you articulate that again? You're saying that someone might...
So the wager is basically saying what actually makes more sense. It makes more sense for someone to believe in Christianity. This would be the more rational choice.
Yeah.
And yet we don't choose that.
Yep.
We make irrational choices.
That's right, yeah.
And that's a reflection of human wretchedness.
That's right, yeah. So it could be, and I've never actually, put those two together, but it could be that even a person's refusal to accept the that prudential wager could be a symptom of his fallenness, his epistemic wretchedness, as I might say. And so, yeah, any of those appeals can certainly be rebuffed by someone who simply doesn't want to believe it.
Because as you mentioned, towards the beginning, Pascal pointed out that rational arguments often are not effective.
Right.
And that's somewhat of a rational argument.
It is.
This is a more rational choice.
Yes.
And yet you don't make it. And so that's why he talks about reasons of the heart.
Right, yeah.
There's something beyond that.
Yeah.
Now, you spend a lot of time as well talking about the image of God and what that means. And in your discussion of the image of God and the vertical relationship, you discuss sonship.
Yeah.
So someone asked the question, how do you view then kind of the Old Testament motive of sonship being like of the Davidic kings and specifically of the Messiah?
Yeah.
How does that sonship relate to the sonship of the image of God?
Yeah, there's a very clear connection in terms of a biblical theological theme that carries that idea of sonship through not just the Davidic, but even the people. Israel was considered, Israel is my son. Out of Egypt have I called my son. Even God's redeeming of Israel out of Egypt was a redemption of his firstborn, his son. But then you finally come to Jesus, who is the true Son of God. So yeah, there would be a strong connection, I think, from that sonship motif from Genesis all the way down to the New Testament. Actually, I made brief reference to Luke chapter 3 in the genealogy there. The following episode is where Jesus, as the Son of God, faces the temptations in the wilderness. And Satan's provocation is, if you are the Son of God. And Jesus proves by his resisting that temptation what Adam, the Son of God, failed to do, that he is the true Son of God. So in that sense then, in Christ, we can be the sons and daughters of God by virtue of our relationship with him.
So is that a sonship, but like a truer sonship? Because everyone's the son of God in being the image of God, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying the fact that you're in the image of God in some sense makes you a son of God.
Yeah, I would say that the relationship of God to humanity is parallel with the relationship between a father and his son. So in a sense, you can say that the purpose of our bearing the image of God is so that we can relate to God as sons would. Not that we do.
Okay.
Not that we do.
So you wouldn't say that everyone in the image of God relates to God as father and son.
Right, yeah.
That's what they were made to do.
That's what we're made to do, yeah. Okay. Yeah, which is why I think that the illustration of the prodigal son is apt, because he is, that sonship is there, but he's estranged from his father. Mm-hmm. So you have fallen human beings as yet image bearers fail to live up to the purpose for which they're created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So,
kind of continuing on that idea of the image of God, you spend a lot of time discussing or emphasizing that the image is not marred or vitiated or diminished, that it's perverted. And then you also talk about the fact that it's restored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So what do you mean? What's restored?
Yeah, what is restored is the expressions of that imagedness. Now, I caught myself a couple times because I'm using that word imagedness as a very cumbersome way of making a shorthand reference to our having been created in the image of God. Okay, so that doesn't change. Our having been created in the image of God doesn't change, but the way we express that is what is perverted. So when we then believe in Jesus Christ and we bear his image and we become conformed into his image, the way that we express our imagedness is then restored. Although whether or not someone ever becomes a believer, yet they still bear the image of God. It's a very subtle distinction, but you can tell what I'm trying to steer away from claiming that some people possess the image of God to greater or lesser degrees on the one hand, but at the same time maintaining that there is a sense in which we might, there's a sense in which people that don't believe in Jesus Christ do not express their image in this properly.
So would you say, you're trying to say everyone possesses the image in the same way, but as far as like in reality, but the view of someone else. So if part of the image of God might be in some way that humanity reflects the nature and character of God, that the reflection might be greater or lesser.
That would be a good way to put it.
Depending upon who it is, or
That's
the
right,
projection. Possession's the same. Everyone possesses it.
Yep.
The actual reflection or projection of that image. So the restoration then would not be theoretically in the image itself, as much as how that image is presented.
That's right. Yeah.
Outward.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And by using the word perverted, I'm stressing that it still exists, but it has been fundamentally inverted wrongly to serve self-centered purposes. So the fact that we can exercise, we still exercise dominion over the earth, but our dominion now has a mixture of is now mixed with self-centeredness, which results in destructiveness. So it is, we still see the image of God at work in everything human beings do. But what we're seeing is a warped reflection of it, is to use your terminology, which I think is apt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, kind of thinking about the image of God, you mentioned Christianity's beauty. Scripture talks about God's beauty, the beauty of holiness. How does that relate to the reality that when Jesus came to earth in the image of God, he came without a form of beauty?
Yeah, right.
What's your thoughts on God's beauty, Christianity's beauty, and yet Jesus came that there was no beauty that we would desire him?
Well, certainly Jesus' beauty consisted, for one thing, in his moral excellence. And so there was beauty has the idea of something, a fittingness, something corresponding in an appropriate way to what is true. And so Jesus, in that sense, the way that Jesus behaved, the way he thought and spoke, was the paragon of beauty. He said, I always do the will of my Father. I always do the things that please him. And so even though Jesus subjected himself to a body that was not perfect, as any human body would not be, and especially as his life progressed and he died on the cross, there was no beauty that we should desire him. Yet morally speaking, there was that beauty there. And I think that's the sense in which then we become beautiful in our moral attractiveness, because our actions and our thoughts correspond more fittingly to the beauty of God's nature, his holiness. Jonathan Edwards makes a big deal about the beauty. He's talking about he has an essay on Christian virtue. He talks a lot about the beauty that is inherent in virtue. So,
good. A few questions kind of related to the nature of the argument that you are setting forth. Can you discuss a little bit more the idea of abductive arguments versus inductive and deductive, and how that relates to the measure of certainty in an argument?
Yeah, right. A deductive argument is absolutely certain. So a deductive argument would be something like 1 + 1 is 2. It's an argument in which the conclusion follows unmistakably and certainly from the premises, as long as they relate in a sound way and are true to the conclusion. So you can have certainty about a deductive argument. An inductive argument would be like saying that the sun is going to rise in the morning. It's not absolutely certain like a deductive argument is, but I'm basing that inductive argument on the fact that the sun has come up for countless mornings prior to this. So it did it for however long humans can remember. It's probably going to do it again. That's inductive argument. It yields a less degree of certainty. Abductive argument also yields a less degree of certainty, but it is also the most certain way we have to live our lives. It is simply, we reason abductively all the time when we're trying to size up a situation. So it's how much of our knowledge can really be deductive in its certainty? Very little, I think. But that does not mean that it's not worth believing, because otherwise we'd have to dispense of a great deal of our belief systems. Our apparatus would be extremely thin if we did that. So abductive reasoning is I would say, and I've not done a study on this, but the bulk of the reasoning we do is abductive. And so it makes sense to then put this in the category of abductive reasoning because it's a very accessible way that we think. So
Now you, in laying out your argument, you point out, Pascal's exegetes humanity.
Yep.
He doesn't really go to Scripture.
That's
and one
right.
of the things you're trying to do is, maybe correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong, put the argument on a more sure foundation.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So if that's true, how concerned should we be about certainty and surety in our arguments? If you're saying an abductive argument, it's not complete certainty.
Yeah.
Is that something we should want? Should we want to say Christianity's the best explanation, or should we say Christianity's true and provides the best explanation?
I'll divide your question into a couple of parts because on the one hand, what I want to do is substantiate his argument biblically, just to make sure that from a theological perspective, we're not going a direction we don't want to go. That's the reason why I took a significant chunk of time to explain the meaning of the Imago Dei, to make sure that that mapped positively onto Pascal's analysis of the human condition. And I argued that it did, that we could see the same paradoxical duality, the same tensions in the doctrine of the image of God and human sin as we did in Pascal's idea of greatness and wretchedness, right? So I wanted to substantiate that biblically. Now, in terms of then the certainty, so I wanted to be certain that I was theologically right about that. Okay, so and I think we can do that pretty well based on a biblical argument. In terms of the certainty of how certain we can be of that argument. Now, the abductive argument that Pascal is suggesting was one stage of his overall project. After saying abductively that Christianity offers the best explanation for the data of human experience, the next logical step in that argument to convince a listener would be to compare that explanation with the other major explanations that people tend to hold and say, this explanation fails to account for this. This explanation, let's say an atheistic evolutionary worldview. You could say, well, that accounts for the human life drive, right? But it fails to account for the death drive, right? So you can start eliminating other explanations, carving that away, and say, you see, the only ones left is Christian anthropology, is a Christian explanation. So yeah, the abductive argument doesn't yield the certainty of a deductive argument, but taken as a cumulative case for the Christian faith, I think it's very strong. Now, your specific question then is how concerned we should be for certainty. Is that what you were asking?
That was an aspect.
Yeah, that was, yeah. I think that the only real certainty comes as a gift from God when we see the light of the glory of God as it is in the face of Jesus Christ. I mean, there really is. That's the only way that the darkness of our self-deception is going to be overcome. And in some sense, that remains a mystery as to how and when and why God chooses to work in a person's heart in that way.
Yeah. So continuing in this realm, you mentioned the next step after you kind of say this is the best explanation, look at other explanations. You talk about in Pascal's kind of three aspects of his apologetic argument, the middle one being make people wish Christianity were true.
Yeah.
And how exactly would you say he does that?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that in this argument people come away saying, boy, I wish Christianity were true?
Yeah, because he pointed out a problem in human beings that they felt they needed a solution in. It would be kind of like realizing your house was on fire and saying, I wish there was such a thing as water to put this out. You've got to the point where you've made someone see you're in a big problem. The way he did that was by helping them see that there is a paradox of unhappiness and happiness, that the more you examine them, the more frustrating and the more distant the solution comes. Until you're willing to accept that you are such a creature that is not intended to be satisfied by anything finite. That's how he makes us wish Christianity were true. So you get to the point where you're saying, I hope that there is something infinite to satisfy the void in my heart. I hope there is absolute truth to satisfy my craving for truth. I hope there is something significant enough to attach my significance to such that I'm not always searching for it, right? So you get to that point where you wish that something that, like Christianity is true, and you're desperate enough to hear what the answer might be. And I think that's what Pascal has done quite effectively.
So you in the answer to your previous question, you kind of say, maybe I'm wrong, that the next step after that would be to say, what are the other explanations?
Right. So you'd have make them wish they were true, show them Christianity were true, prove that it is, and maybe you'd have to add another stage. That'd be the eliminative stage, where you'd eliminate the other explanations to say, well, there are rival conceptions. There's transhumanism and Hinduism and all kinds of things that have some. The reason why they're appealing to people is because they speak to some truth that they feel within themselves. But what I would argue is that they will always end up exaggerating either the greatness or the wretchedness of human beings and fail. They don't have the breadth of scope to account for the full complexity of the human condition.
Now, would you see, to me, the best place that would fit is actually in that step of saying, I wish Christianity were true, in part because these other things aren't.
Right, yeah.
So if I think, man, there is this, like, I want happiness, and yet I don't get it. And so this tells me, this should make me happy, but it doesn't.
Yeah, right.
This tells me it doesn't. And so that's in that same
Right.
realm in which you're trying to say, is that a place you'd want to bring that in, or would you want to hold that
No,
off?
actually, I think that would be, I think it would totally depend on who you're talking to. It would totally depend on how you want to present it. Because you could end up dealing with it near the end, or you could end up dealing with it right in the moment when the question arises. Like, you feel a craving for certainty, but you can't seem to grasp the truth, and yet you feel uncertain about things. And at that moment, you can talk about maybe the pitfalls of arrogant dogmatism versus this apparent epistemic humility. Like, oh, we can't really know anything about anything. Well, how do you know that, right? Okay, so you're cutting the legs out from under that. Or this arrogant dogmatism, actually Pascal speaks a great deal about. And that would be a way of, in that stage, saying, well, neither skepticism nor radical dogmatism satisfies you there. There must be another way.
Like, have you done much work in teasing this out specifically with other explanations? And if so, could you offer a brief,
the closest
brief way to go through it?
The closest I've gone, as far as eliminating other explanations, well, the closest I've gone to that would have been interacting with the atheistic, evolutionary worldview, which is what I did a little bit when I was talking about Freud's life drive and death drive, and even the altruism and selfishness. So where in an evolutionary, I'm talking a materialistic evolution, where in that scheme of explanation can you account for altruism? Did that help our species survive somehow? And then you have to figure out how that happened, and or the whole idea of another one would be why do we have this persistent, ineradicable idea that there is a God or gods? Is it really, as Dawkins says, a evolutionary misfiring, or does it make more sense to say that we are constituted for a relationship with a being that we have now cut ourselves off from? And that explains the diversity in religious belief, but also explains the presence of religious belief. So in doing that, I'm interacting with rival explanations and saying, no, this one, it accounts for that. That's fine, but it doesn't account for that. So you have to knock it out. The explanation that is the best is the one that accounts for all the data.
Now, we had some discussion earlier today, and you mentioned Pascal's often accused of kind of a fideism.
Yes, right, yeah.
And that's pretty common in presuppositional apologetics.
Yep.
It's just kind of like, that's the accusation.
Yeah.
How would you push back against someone who's, and especially, I guess, put it this way. So you mentioned atheistic materialism.
Yeah.
Someone who says, well, why couldn't Islam kind of offer the same? We actually offer the best explanation for what humanity is like.
Yeah.
Or some version of Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, right.
Or whatever. Like another theistic perspective.
I see.
How would you push back against their claim to say our explanation's better or just as good?
Could I answer your fideist question first? He has been labeled a fideist because he talked a lot about the heart, like the heart has reasons that reason cannot know. But he's using the word heart in a very special sense. He's using the word heart to refer to the cravings, the existential angst that human beings find themselves in. He's not saying believe against all reason. There are some that label him as a irresponsible kind of fideist. What I understand Pascal's perspective on the relationship between faith and reason is not that he dispensed reason, it's that he was highly skeptical of the fallen human being's ability to reason. So his critique was not of reason itself, but of our cognitive apparatus. He said, the reason why mere reason isn't going to do with anybody is because our way of thinking has been messed up. We're inherently predisposed to disbelieve. And so we're going to have to use other routes. We're going to have to appeal to the heart. We're going to have to address the cravings that they know, that they feel. Not that that's not cognitive. You can bring it out to the surface and put it into words, but that's what he means by that. And that's why I would say he's not a fideist in that sense. Now, as far as how then it would be a better explanation than these other theistic worldviews, I have some answers, but it would take some experts in those fields. Like I think the fields of comparative religion would be very fruitful in this regard, because then you'd be able to study what they believe about the human nature, compare it with Protestant Christian anthropology, and see how they don't line up, and see which one accounts better for the data of the human condition.
So related to that, you're encouraging us to use this kind of argument. But
Yeah,
we're not all going to be experts in all those things, like you're saying.
Right, yeah.
So is it still a helpful argument for us? Do I need to learn what these other worldviews say about it? Or can it be effective just knowing the Christian understanding of anthropology and understanding humanity?
Yeah, I think it is effective, even if it aren't an expert on all those rival explanations. You don't have to be an expert on all of those in order to say, no, Christianity does explain your condition. Now, if you are talking to somebody who is entrenched in one of those worldviews, it might be helpful to get some resources on that. But certainly you can leverage that with anybody that you talk to help them see how their condition finds its explanation only in their having fallen from their having been created in the image of God. So, yeah.
So kind of a final question for me, and then you're welcome to expand on anything else you want to hit. You touched on this in the end, but perhaps share just some practical ways this has been helpful for you, and maybe talking to unbelievers, conversations you've had, just how this has practically benefited you in interactions. Yeah,
one thing I would say, I'll speak to about me personally, and then about my ministry and with people. It's helpful on a personal level for me to understand what's going on when I seek to be distracted or entertained. It's caused me to pause and think, what am I trying to distract myself from? Is there something about myself that I'm not dealing with right now? This is one of Pascal's points. He says, you'll do everything you can to keep from thinking about your destiny, where you're really going. That's why the worst thing you can do is sit in a room quiet all by yourself, without your phone, without a book, without anything, because you're not happy in yourself. So it's been a prod for me to seek my joy in God and God alone. Personally, it's very edifying to think about that. And another way in which it's helpful for me is helping me understand the culture around me. From one perspective, if you overemphasize human sinfulness, which I think many people can do, like rightly so, human beings are utterly depraved, and yet if you focus on that mantra, the human heart is, we're deceitful above all things, desperately, who can know it? Then you look at the world around you and you can find yourself scratching your head at why non-Christians are capable of such extraordinarily good deeds. And then it can cause you to look back and say, well, does the Bible really know what it's talking about when they say that human beings are utterly sinful? And in fact, that can be a moment of tremendous angst and doubt when, if say a child grew up in a Christian family that emphasized very strongly the depravity of man, didn't have much interaction. Then he meets friends and interacts with people like, these are really good people, and yet they don't believe in Christ. So then it casts doubt on what they were taught. If we are taught a better and more robust doctrine of the image of God, it will teach us to expect both good and bad. It will teach us to expect, but none of the good is redeeming good. None of the good is meritorious good. Even the good, even the plowing of the wicked is sin, right? So that is just a helpful framework for understanding culture and human behavior. And then as far as interacting with people, I think it's more informed my preaching and application more than anything else in terms of my interaction with people. It's allowed me to have an avenue for application to even believers. Are you trying to fill your life with something that is not God? Is God glorious enough to be enjoyed for all eternity? Well, if so, will you enjoy him tomorrow? Or will you enjoy these, or you seek pleasure in these other things? So there is tremendous applicational force and value in considering the condition, the human condition, that we have fallen into sin. So those are some directions that I go in my personal life with that.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your
this
time.
has been great.
And thank you all for joining us. Glad you could be with us here today. And look forward to seeing you back on August 11th for our next webinar.